During the 19th century, many newly industrialized nations set up the basic architecture of modern mass schooling, which remains with us to the present day. During this period, the nation-state gradually assumed responsibility for the schooling of its citizenry. As the state assumed responsibility for schooling, it did not design schools from scratch. Rather, state agencies used technologies of schooling that had already been developed and refined by a range of religious and philanthropic organizations. These organizations had, independently of the state, already been extending schooling to the poor and, as yet, disenfranchised masses in the first decades of that century. In doing so, they had been borrowing, as Foucault argues in Discipline and Punish, from a range of other institutional sites, including the newly developing hospitals, factories, and prisons of the 19th century. At the beginning of that century, the first mass schools established by philanthropic and religious organizations, called monitorial schools, were organized rather like factories, bringing together vast numbers of poor children and imposing upon them a common regimen. These schools were also laboratories of a kind. They were places in which the children of the poor could be observed and scrutinized. The monitorial school combined architectural design with intimate record keeping in such a way that pupils were at all times available for inspection. In his highly influential book, Discipline and Punish, Michel Foucault links the development of such institutions to a broader shift in operations of government, where those at the bottom of the social order were rendered increasingly transparent to power through forms of inspection. Up until this point, they had been, he argues, largely ignored. From now on, by contrast, the masses became interesting to power in the intimate detail of their lives. Schools have performed a vital function in this regard over the last 2 centuries, helping to make the citizenry increasingly visible to others and open to manipulation via its children. This is the first form of examination that the modern school facilitated, a detailed kind of record-keeping and close inspection of everyday habits. According to Foucault's argument, a modern citizenry would learn to govern itself in intimate detail because it felt the constant gaze of a form of inspection for which no aspect of one's life was too trivial to be of note. Citizen subjects would learn to live and act as if constantly observed. Arguably, the prototypical institution in which they acquired this habit was the modern school. As Michel Foucault argues, the opportunity for study afforded by the modern school led to the rapid growth of the human sciences in the 19th century, establishing an intimate nexus between knowledge and power. Disciplinary institutions such as schools, prisons, and hospitals produced knowledge that could then be reapplied to inform the development of future disciplinary practices, framing what it meant to be a pupil or child or patient in disciplinary institutional terms. This point is worth dwelling upon, since modern schooling, with its origins in a factory-like school hall, is commonly associated with the opposite trend, namely a narrowing of knowledge, the reduction of what is taught to what is examined. This is, of course, true in one sense. School curricula, especially in recent years, have been successively narrowed, at least in Britain, which is my own context. But the very same disciplinary environments are at the same time producing vast amounts of data that are used to govern a citizenry. Schools may narrow what is taught, but they also are responsible in the proliferation of knowledge about those they house. But there is another key development too. The early 19th century monitorial school did not supply the only major technology that went into the development of state schooling. This disciplinary institution was soon accompanied by the mid-19th century moral training school, where decidedly more intimate systems of government were integrated within the operations of modern teaching. Moral training schools developed and applied a form of pastoral power, deriving this approach from earlier Christian institutions. These institutions had themselves adapted and transformed the spiritual practices of ancient philosophy during the long period of medieval and Renaissance Christianity. I give some account of this in The Cynical Educator, chapters 3 and 4, and a more detailed discussion of the moral training school as a site of power in Benign Violence, part 1. Pastoral examination is the second form of examination developed by the modern school. This form of examination was facilitated by the modern school and, together with record keeping, the first form of examination just considered, helps explain, I think, how the school system operates as a system of power. This second form of examination is, in a sense, the opposite of the first. It is not impersonal and does not measure. Rather, it is involved and deeply personalized. It is concerned with the development of interpersonal relationships and attempts to regulate people by way of those relationships. It was here, in the moral training school, that the educational influence typical of the priest in rural, pre-urban communities continued, where the teacher adopted a social role once reserved for the local pastor or priest. Transported to the towns and cities of the Industrial Revolution, the priest's responsibility for the government of souls was taken over by the school teacher. Appropriated as part of the teacher's duty of care, techniques for governing the church congregation were introduced again into education. The logic of pastoral care developed further the idea that teaching should be considered a form of professional sacrifice for the present and future moral, social, and educational well-being of the pupil. The pastoral teacher of the moral training school based his, or increasingly her, professional identity and judged the success of his or her work on the strength of those connections established with pupils. In the moral environment of the modern school, the pastoral teacher signified the moral template to which all members of that school were expected to aspire. As Ian Hunter argues in his seminal book, Culture and Government, this teacher would embody norms whose very inaccessibility was intended to inspire a relationship of constant emulation. End quote. Here, the pastoral schoolteacher was expected to place him or herself on such terms with his or her pupils so they could, without fear, make the teacher their confidant. The purpose was to develop the child's capacity to reflect on and govern the self, internalizing a process of moral supervision so that it became automatic. Despite the heavy moral discourse that underpinned this mode of teaching, the morally steeped practices of 19th century education are not as distant as we might think. Indeed, as Hunter argues, we might already see within the mid-19th century moral training school the origins of more recent ideas, such as those, to quote, of a child-centered pedagogy overseen by an unobtrusive yet vigilant teacher. End quote. More recent pedagogies that pay attention to the natural environment and dispositions of the child may be seen to operate along similar lines, functioning to bring attention to a child's existing dispositions so that these natural tendencies may become the object of intervention and self-government. Our present education system is perhaps less forthcoming in declaring its moralizing mission, and lacks the kind of clearly articulated rationale that a moral philosopher might recognize. But it is no less imbued with techniques of moral formation. It could be argued that a system which functions by lavishing attention in various ways on the individual formation of educational subjects so that they may become productive within a wider social space is only more intensively pursued today. This, for Hunter, is the result of an intimate and reciprocating relationship between the intensification of the personal sphere and the expansion of the sphere of public administration." End quote. Hunter's analysis casts doubt on the claims made for child-centered or progressive education, namely the underpinning idea that these are liberatory practices that evade the constraining effects of power. I would argue that modern schooling is still defined by the connection it maintains between the formation of individual subjectivities and the administration of society. Furthermore, I would argue that all claims on behalf of education to liberate individuals, to allow them to flourish and achieve their potential, be considered critically and carefully in light of the history of schooling as a site of moral training. This, at least, is one of the implications of Foucault's Discipline and Punish, a seminal text in the critique of education.